You're welcome.
And so I think I'd like to just start us off with an introduction because we have a special guest in today's episode. Lisa Clark Diller is the Brett Mahoney Endowed Chair of History at Southern Adventist. No, I'm just kidding. Dr. Diller is.
May it be so. May it be so.
Well, once those student loans get paid off, we'll get started right on it. Dr. Diller is the chair of the history department at Southern Adventist University, where I had just the best time for 4 years of my life, learning from you and from Dr. Pettibone and Dr. Peach and Dr. MacArthur. And so I really appreciate you being a part of this conversation and talking about the history of movements. And I'm excited to see what we come out of this conversation as far as the right ingredients, or maybe we won't, and that will be useful as well. And so I guess I just wanted to start with, you are active in the Chattanooga community. I see a lot in your social media feeds, both in the women's marches and in marches and movements. And then you're also very active in your church, it seems like, in social progress. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about, what is Chattanooga doing right now? What is your community doing right now? What is Southern doing right now? And what are you proud of?
Yeah, I think it's hard. I think we will look back. We're not just looking back, we're talking about it right now, how much the pandemic related slowdowns and slowdowns and extra time and emotional space potentially have contributed to people being able to do thinking about this. So I think that it'll be hard to talk about those things apart from each other in the future when we're looking at what happened. Certainly we're experiencing them together. But what that means though is that not being able to be together has challenged some of, I will say for sure, Southerns. Like, not only is it summertime, school's out, a lot of students are not in the area. And then also we're not on campus. Faculty aren't on campus. Tons of us don't live. Unlike some potential college towns where lots of faculty live right then or close together, and there's stronger community. There is not that at Southern. There are, 30,000 Adventists in the greater Chattanooga area, and, 40 churches and things like that. So it's a very diverse and diffuse group. So that said, Southern, I don't have as strong a sense in terms, as a department, we have things that we're doing. That's a finite group. Also same with church. So when the George Floyd murder happened really quickly, several of our social leaders in our group. I was actually out of town. I had agreed to go down and breach sort of quarantine things to see my sister that week. And in Florida, I was out of town, but we had a vigil, our church did locally, and we produced Black Lives Matter signs, love thy neighbor, like an overtly scriptural passage with Black Lives Matter that we handed out to people. And our neighbors all wanted some. So we made a couple of printings of them so people could give them to their neighbors, kind of yard signs. So, and now we're as a church thinking about where we go forward. I will say that the community I do a lot of this thinking in is Adventist Peace Fellowship. And that is a wider group of Adventists across the world, not just, by world, the Anglophone world primarily. So including the UK, Australia, New Zealand, places like that, Canada. So I have that community to kind of be thinking about these things in and doing conversations and Zoom. So yeah, I think I feel like I've wandered afield of your question. When I came back from being gone for a week, Chattanooga was having nightly demonstrations. And I did choose to go to one because I think I live, this is a totally personality trait. It's been like this since I was 12, 11. I don't know how other people are, but I live constantly aware of the fact that I'm going to be looking back on this moment.
You're a good historian that way, I guess.
Yes, I am. Like I did not realize that as a child. I was very nostalgic. I cultivate nostalgia for the present. Like our first apartment in Chicago, I never walked up the stairs of that apartment without having the feeling like I'm going to be remembering this someday. Like this is our salad days. We're going to be looking back on this, like how it smells, how we live. We are very aware we were there for a small period of time. So all of that to say, like, I'm like, I will be looking back on this. What will I wish I had done? I will wish I had gone to at least one of those demonstrations. And so I can't afford to go every night for a ton of reasons, even if that was what I wanted to do all of the time. It just can't happen. So Tommy and I and a couple of friends went out. We brought the average age down by about 15 years by going. It's a lot of young people. They were almost all wearing masks, which just tells you how politicized mask wearing has become in our country. That like these are young people who all of the research shows us are not wearing masks when they gather together in almost any other context. But when they are doing something that is political, they are signaling their political choices by wearing a mask, which is good for us all, that they're doing that in that context. I wish they'd do it in a few other contexts, but that just, that it didn't feel like we were contributing to the, as being married to somebody who works in surgery and in that medical field, we were being very careful about how we contribute to the pandemic as well. But so, yeah, I guess that sort of covers I have been very aware, and this was also Brett, I tend to be very careful about my postings on social media, and I curate them. You don't always know why you're seeing what you're seeing. I have very specific groups, especially in Facebook, and I curate the social media accounts for our department. And so sometimes I will just put things up for the department. Some of them are just Instagram, some are both Instagram and Facebook. But I know our students are watching, and I know that they want to know. This is what I hear over and over from them. Like, they want to know that someone in their faith tradition is paying attention to what is going on and is saying something. They may not agree about what it's about, but that ignoring it or not saying anything, in which it's annoying to have to like deal with comments and, I don't want to spend emotional energy and time. I got stuff to read, stuff to write. Don't feel like having to like constantly, moderate. But I did intentionally post, and sometimes I do because I do that because silence speaks. Not saying something is saying something. And so I don't want my students to think we're not engaged in what's going on.
Well, I think that, yeah, that's very important. My wife is in charge of the School of Behavioral Health social media platform, and this has been a very difficult time for her to make sure that posts are appropriate and aren't absent as well, and then dealing with the feedback from that. I'm very much the other way, where I rarely post much of anything, and usually if I do, it's a sandwich, which I guess shows what I'm passionate about. But one of the things that you said was that in the pandemic period, this has really changed the way that we advocate or that we come together in some of these things. Do you see that having a long-term effect on the success of this movement? Because we have, on one hand, we have seen our inability to come together collectively, but also, I live outside of LA, and we've had marches in tens of thousands strong where people, in spite of the pandemic, are out. And so it shows the passion and energy. But do you see an evolution in the way that we stand up for social injustice, or the way that we try to move movements through social media more like we have for the last decade, we'll say? And do you think that has an effect on the longevity of those movements, or our attention span as it relates to those movements? Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
The reason why I'm asking is because kind of one of the things that I'm trying to understand, being only 35, having seen what's happened after Ferguson, what's happened after George Floyd, and also seeing things like Occupy Wall Street and some of these other types of movements. I see our attention span flickering a lot. And so that's kind of jaded my experience with social justice and the social justice movements. And I think that that's just one perspective. Again, as the guy who just posts his sandwich on social media, I shouldn't be judging what I see, but I'm just curious to know what you think about that.
I'm also curious about, we haven't heard from Ethan yet either. Like, Ethan, you both are history majors? You are a history major as well, Ethan?
You're muted.
I was a English major turned philosophy major.
Fantastic, though. And that's in the same department, though, right? You know.
Well, English was a whole department here, and then humanities was actually the closest I could get to a philosophy major. They had a concentration.
Yeah.
Later, they fired my philosophy professor for being a philosopher at an Adventist institution. So I got a good education, but I don't know. I don't know before or since what all has gone there. But it was, my major in college was a real awakening. I was trying to awaken my brain before that, but it was hit and miss. And then in college, not just through that, but through some of the literature and some of the kind of Western thought classes and stuff, I really got my brain lit on fire for understanding the whys at the same time as trying to understand everyone's whys and hows at the same time that I was trying to figure out what should my whys and hows be. How should I actually live? What should I support? How should I treat other people? And ultimately, how should I vote and behave in the marketplace and things?
Preaching to the choir, but that's exactly what we all think education should be, right? I tell students nowadays, and incoming students as well as ones that get there, you come to university, undergraduate education, to learn to ask and to think about answers to two questions. One is, what do you mean by that? And how do you know? Meaning epistemology, like what counts as evidence for you. And if you can stretch towards some possible answers for yourself to those questions, that's great. But learning also like when and how to ask those questions is important. Also in the philosophy joke, people with PhDs that have doctorates of philosophy but aren't philosophers, right? And so which I am not, and I read enough philosophy to respect it, and maybe just observe the conversations. But one of my friends who's a historian was just posting that his son, I think in the 4s, 5s, 6s or something like that, asked him, like, are you helping people? You're a doctor. Like, do you have to help people in the pandemic? And he goes, no, I'm a doctor of philosophy. And the son said, is philosophy an illness? And so those are just one of our, favorite philosophy jokes. So anyway, so that's great that your background. Historians are interested, unlike more of the humanities. Like, I feel like part of the difference between history stands at the intersection of the humanities and the social sciences. So it shares a lot in common, and we sometimes think of ourselves as humanities, but we really overlap heavily with social sciences as well. And so depending on your temperament and interest as a historian, you may sit more in with the humanities straight up, or you may be over with economics and politics and anthropology and geography and sociology and things like that over with the social sciences. So I swing multiple ways, but probably I'm more social sciencey because I like change over time. And that's what historians are interested in, things that are not timeless, but change over time, which is Brett's question, I think, is really interesting for that. Because when we think about change over time and causation, what causes change? So historians are interested in causation, and cause and effect. And of course, we know things are complex, and we know there's also continuity. We're more interested in when change happens. Just saying everybody lived exactly as they had for 100 years is not interesting to us. So we're wanting to know, like, when did it change? And so that's what we're seeing right here, right? That's part of what we're talking about, and why it's interesting to historians, because mostly we only know if something is changing looking back. And I would say with social change and even with activism, Brett, I mean, I'm being influenced by some readers right now. I'm reading, How to Be an Anti-Racist and other things like that, that are influencing me in terms of, and again, this also builds on a lot of other historical reading that I've done, but that policy changes are what help things actually change. So people are wanting to change hearts and minds in a demonstration, a protest is a little bit more longer lived, and it's specific and has to stand the test of time a bit longer, but demonstrations do things. And I do think what we're experiencing right now, as opposed to potentially Occupy Wall Street or some of the other things we've seen in the last 20, 25 years, is policy change occurring in ways that are new, frankly. And I'm excited for young people because because I'm a Gen Xer and you are all right on the edge of that probably, between millennial and Xers. And I think millennials have potentially some of the same experience that Xers have. We are a very cynical generation. Xers are. We're very cynical. We don't really think, and I think older millennials are as well, potentially. And we didn't get to see, I mean, in one sense, I'm right in the middle of Gen X, and I got to see some massive change that no one was expecting. The frickin' Berlin Wall came down. I mean, you've never seen anything like 1989. Like I was in high school. I remember when Solidarity won. Solidarity won the elections in Poland and it was allowed to stand. They beat the Communist Party. And I would tell my boyfriend at the time, I was like, oh my gosh, like I read Newsweek magazine cover to cover religiously for about 15 years of my life, starting when I was about 14. And I was so excited. And he was like, this has happened before, you know, that there's been a little moment of opening. And he was right. That's true. That had happened before. But looking back, we know it was the beginning of something actually real huge changing. And then also apartheid ended. Like we did not think that was going to happen. And these, by the way, are things that had not been around for super long periods of time. They've been around for 40 or 50 years. But they had made real change. So when I think about, well, I won't get distracted on something else here, but I will say that institutions and policy make things real. So the Berlin Wall, which was only around, you know, if you think about East-West Germany, you know, 45 years that there's East-West Germany and an East-West Berlin. 20 years after the Berlin Wall falls, 2% of marriages in Berlin are between East and West Berliners. So just because like they have the same, we would say language, like what's going on. The institutional structures had only been that way for 40 years, but it created a new reality. I'd be interested. I read that statistic 10 years ago, maybe. And so it'd be interesting to see how long it takes before you finally have something. And it only had been 40 years. And we're not talking about people that speak different languages or had highly different cultures going back a long way or anything like that. So it's that the institutional structures, when you change policy, you make new things possible. Like, and I am influenced by the idea, just trying to change hearts and minds doesn't do as much as actually changing policy, and or taking down institutional barriers in ways that aren't there, you know, and you know, what is it? One of the economists from the University of Chicago talks about nudge, you know, the idea that, you know, even if you want widespread freedom for people economically is kind of what they're talking about. You can influence choices. You can make it more likely that people are going to give their organs to be organ donors, and less likely through certain kinds of nudging and through certain kinds of policies like opt out versus opt in and things like that. So, you know, I don't want to get too distracted on all of that, but I do think we are seeing real change happening now. And I'm excited for the young people who are seeing change resulting from their action. Because most of what I study in history, which is why, you know, you're paying me the big bucks to be here today, is that people don't see the change occur from their action. They work long, hard, slogging hours. They spend their life trying to do the right thing. And they don't get to see the fruits of it. I spent this whole last semester teaching a class on women and civil rights. You want to talk about people not seeing the outcome of their work. You know, these women that just, I mean, people made fun of them. They lost all kinds of opportunities in life. They worked so hard. They get so close and it wouldn't happen. And they were seen as kind of crazy and making things difficult and just making things unpleasant for people, you know, by bringing this up all the time when there, you know, you could just be, you know, a happy wife and mother or a teacher if you didn't want to get married or something. Like, why do you have to make things difficult for people all the time? And then nothing is happening and you keep bringing it up all the time, you know? And so that's just one, and those women were organized. And there were different kinds of organizations that they had for it. But I will tell you, there has never been a group of people that can organize like Black women in America. So when they were often excluded from white women's organizations, the vast majority of the time, but they ran civil society organizations on Black American women where they would get they would organize, financial, like insurance organizations for each other. They would organize voters whenever they were finally allowed to do that. But I mean, these women could get people together. They could fundraise. They could get a school started and fundraise for it and keep it in the intention in front of everybody. I mean, and it was exhausting work. It killed them young. And they just so rarely saw the long-term outcomes. But gradually things did sometimes change. Sometimes it didn't. And sometimes it's only looking back that it took us 70 years to make this policy when these people were advocating for it this long ago and they had smart ideas about it. So it can be discouraging. And I do think there's temperaments, Brett, that are set up for that more than others. I mean, it's legit to acknowledge your own temperament in that and say, this isn't going to be my thing. I don't want to be. Profits are difficult. And the great thing about the Walla Walla History Department is that for decades, it was the Department of History and Prophecy. Wow. And that is a strong title. That's a strong name for a department. I'm jealous of that heritage. Yeah.
Well, and they shared a hallway with religion. You went upstairs to the 4th floor, history and religion.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
That's rich.
We called it ascending.
Yeah. That's right. No, that's rich. So again, architecture is king. You make collaboration possible by how you build buildings and who's going to have conversations in the hallway or in the bathrooms or, at the place where everyone puts their food in the refrigerator or whatever. You literally make it more or less possible for collaboration to happen by how you structure.
And people flowed between the departments too. Ron Jolliffe, I don't know if you know him, moved from the religion department to the history department. So
that's right.
So one thing that just came up as you were talking about the labors of a generation that didn't get to see, certainly not everything they wanted. I was recalled of, I still think this is the single most hardcore quote I've ever heard from anyone. And I don't know precisely the origins. I know it was someone called William of Orange, and this was 300 or 400 years ago. But he was trying to do some kind of revolutionary or separatist movement. And he never had any success with it in his lifetime, I guess. But the quote that he left at some point was, "It is not necessary to have hope in order to persevere." And something like 120 years after he died, the things that he was after came to fruition. And I've just kind of been in awe of that mentality, to have it, to speak it so clearly. And I know that many other people that have not dropped a beautiful quote like that into the historical quote drop, but have felt and acted that way.
I mean, I tell you, after the election in 2016, 2 days after the election, it was on a Tuesday. On Thursday, I flew to DC for the North American Conference on British Studies conference in DC. It was in DC that year. Separate from this moment, you've never seen such an emotional group of historians. At least I never have in my life. People were literally sobbing in sessions, so upset about what had happened. But I got there early. I flew up in the morning, and the first sessions weren't until 2 p.m. and I couldn't check into my hotel. So I went directly to the new National Museum of African American History and Culture, because I could stop by. I took the train in from the airport, and I could just stop at the Smithsonian stop, and I had a small suitcase, and I didn't know at the time, you had to have tickets way ahead in advance. I waited till it opened, and there was a line, and I got in the line. When I got up there, I saw people were handing pieces of paper. I knew it was Smithsonian. I thought, we don't have to pay. It's do I need to pay for tickets somewhere else? Do I need to get that? And the gentleman who was checking people's tickets, he must have been what kind of crazy lady is this? Because literally when I look back later, you couldn't get tickets until April at that point, because they were only letting so many people in, and he was just have a nice day, just let me in, which I did not realize like how much I was, impinging on, oh, I'll just show up and, get to be right in. But so it was very new at that moment. I've been there 3 times since then, but it was incredible the hope that they did have, or some of them probably didn't have hope and worked anyway. Like, I think I just was Googling your quote there, William the Silent. I studied William of Orange, who invaded England in 1688, but, or he was invited over, depending on how you choose to interpret that history. He was assassinated, I think, the guy who dropped that quote.
Yes. And there've been like 3 Williams of Orange, and
right.
yeah, he's not the main one. That's true.
Right. No, but he was a main one because he did start the revolt against Spain, and that's super hard for the little Netherlands to revolt against the Spanish Empire in the 16th century, when it basically runs from the Philippines to, Peru all the way over to the Mediterranean. So it's a great one. And I remember, like, I've heard this said, and I first kind of started taking this on board when it came to like environmental justice and trying to be responsible about care for creation, that maybe me doing my little recycling or reusing or reducing isn't going to make a difference. And here's another thing where policy is very important to change, actual policy, not just a bunch of individual people trying to do the right thing. However, I need to do the right thing, for me. And that's kind of what he's saying. I'm going to persevere in doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do according to my conscience or my ideas of what it is, even if and when I don't see change. I have to do it anyway. So I that's a great quote. I haven't heard that one from him, but I do believe it. And I know there's a lot of people like Ruby Sales is still working. Like, I heard an interview of her on Lisa Sharon Hope's podcast, The Road to Justice. And Ruby Sales was like in jail in the 60s, for trying to register people to vote and stuff. And she's still working. And she has been running for over 10 years. She's been running an organization working about police violence and educating people and holding conferences. And, like, you kind of I feel like I'm totally reading myself into people like that. But I'm sort of like, she must be like, well, welcome to the party, everybody. I've been saying this for years, like, but at the same time, when you've been saying something for a long time, you have to be glad when you see the change happening, but you're kind of like, why wasn't anything I was doing? But she has been working, but she became an atheist early on in her civil rights work, and then came back to the church. And she just has so much rich stuff to say about faith and hope and how that helps animate, and choosing to lean into love and forgiveness. And but mostly, just really, her big question, I think she gave a TED talk 5 or 6 years ago, and her fundamental question is, tell me where it hurts, like when she's asking people. And she cares about poor white people, she cares about, she's working for justice for tons of people. She's a lot of generosity for a lot of American humanity. But thinking about people like that have literally just been working long, hard, slogging decades, and she will say that they work. There's a hopeful, she uses the phrase, I need to write it down, because a couple of times I had to go back and look in the interview to try to get the phrase, and I can't seem to retain it in my head, that she uses, that where she talks about sort of the hopeful dissent, or, people who are just like, continue to live by hope. So I appreciate both of those things, that we are hopeful, that taps into those of us that are optimists, but then for the other people who are like, I don't really, I don't know if anything's going to happen. And yeah, I'm still going to show up and do the right thing.
Yeah. So our big question, and Brett started us off, but I almost want to hand you the whole thing at once and then follow what you say from that. So some movements succeed and some fail. Maybe there's even a problem with that statement. There probably is. But what's the difference? And one thing you've said so far is policy. If a movement can achieve a policy change, then that will probably last and do lots, even if the emotions fade. And you also mentioned unemployment early on. And the kind of the freedom of a group of people, or inspiration of a group of people from economic places to act, to show up. to demand policy change or something. And I know, like way back in movements in England and stuff, or in a variety of places in the UK, sometimes there were mass unemployment, and the mass unemployment was critical to social changes and policy changes. What else? What else do you look at across movements, hundreds or even thousands of years, and say, this one stuck because, or this one petered out because?
Well, I mean, how people respond matters. So humans always have choice. So this is, again, where I think historians are going to be different from things like anthropologists or even political scientists or sociologists who want to come up with rules that kind of, let's look at big sweeps and make rules, whereas historians, we're about the particular. And so we're like, there's no repeating any of this. Like, everything is always different. And so we're less inclined to rules about how things work or big generalizations about everything. That said, we've got opinions, and so, I don't mind mouthing off, even though it's sort of a betrayal of my entire, profession to say, let's now kind of think about how we can make these. I do think there are lessons. They say history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, so there's definitely things that we can learn and think about. The big thing, and Brett talked about the last 100 years. So one of the things we know for a fact is that technology shapes social practice. So when you have technology changes, there's no such thing as neutral technology, like in the sense that, maybe morally neutral or whatever, but you don't, when you're trading with, like, I study the early modern period. And so this 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, when globalization is happening, where the Western hemisphere is getting integrated into the economy of the Western hemisphere, and the Afro-Eurasian markets that have been linked for a long time at Indian Ocean trade and the China, the Silk Road kind of trade that we sort of shorthand for all of that. Now we have like the Pacific, and the Atlantic being connected and all of that in new ways. And none of the stuff that comes is neutral. Nothing is neutral. And it makes social change. Like, there are no large domesticatable animals in North America. I was, my husband and I were bike riding a few weeks ago. We passed this, farm on which there were longhorn cows, like cattle, like with massive. I was like, first of all, that's just weird in Tennessee. But then I just was looking at those cows going, where are those cows? Why do those cows exist anyway? And also, where did they come from originally? So where are those cows originally? People are like, well, Texas. Well, no, because Texas did not have cows before the Spaniards got here. So like, the Spaniards apparently are they in Spain? Like, that's what I want. And my friends were sort of, when I was telling that story, were teasing me. They're like, no one else thinks about the fact that there weren't cows in America before you. The same thing with horses. When we think about the Plains Indians and we think about the lifestyle that comes with horses, and any technology that you bring in, any kind of new product or whatever, changes social practice. And so some of this happens because social practice has changed. I don't know where yours is, but I know where mine is, right? And that's, yeah, of course. And so, that is not neutral. And again, I'm not a naysayer, like, oh, this is the worst thing ever. Like, I'm a person who has always read when I walked, and read incessantly everywhere, and didn't interact with people because I was reading. So, I don't know how much difference it is doing this than how I was as a child with my nose. My mom would be like, get your nose out of a book. It's sort of the same thing. Anyway, I'm not like, this is gloom and doom, but this changes things. It really does. And kind of for the long haul. We're downstream from real technological change. We're downstream from the end of the Cold War, where we have global travel and a lot more connections. We're downstream. Those are real things that have happened. And so when I think about, even in the last 100 years, social change, a lot of it's driven, by television, by the civil rights actors knowing how to basically stage very overt violations of their rights for television cameras. They didn't make those police attack them, but they knew where the cameras were, and they knew what would happen that when it was seen. When Emmett Till's mother asks for an open casket in a television era, that does something, differently. So technology, and I'm only talking about the very basic, most obvious kind of communications technology, but how finances work, how banks are running, how insurance works, how taxes are structured, all of that technology impacts that. We're talking about how we vote now, like, the technology for how we vote. So which movements get to be successful or not in the long run, first of all, is always a reaction to how, so the Magna Carta could have been like, it was that later on people chose to reference the Magna Carta and say, because of the Magna Carta, we do this. This is what historians will always say. We won't know if any of this is successful. It's how we choose to react to it later. Like, so, we may look back and say, oh, this was a time of great progress, or we may say this was a time when like everything hit the fan and we were never a civil society again. We never, it partly depends on how we are choosing to react down the road to these things that happen. And we have chosen, people have died before, tons and tons and tons of people have been dying, but NASCAR is choosing to say, we're going to ban the Confederate flag at our events now. And that's a person that's there, because I don't, like, institutions don't do things. People at institutions do things. So at my university, I don't know how it works at Loma Linda or any other places where you guys work, but people will go, oh, Wright Hall or administration isn't letting us do that. And I'm like, who said to you, you can't do this? Don't just say administration or Wright Hall. Did somebody tell you as a result of a committee's vote or something, and who's on that committee? And we can actually, this is where some of the stuff I've experienced in life and read is overlapping with some of the how to be an anti-racist, where yes, there are corrupt institutions and we can get discouraged and think there's no way of fixing those, but there are people in those places that can be influenced and who get to make choices. And and they're choosing how they are going to respond. And I have theories about that have to do with how Gen Xers and even older millennials, but mostly Gen Xers, are raising their children, which is completely differently than how older generations did, which is we desire positive relationships with our children down the road. And so we're not like drawing lines going, you do that and that's the end of this. We're allowing ourselves to be influenced by our children more and where they go. And so I think there's a whole lot of older people who might be more temperamentally conservative regarding property values and economic policy and what might be happening to the economy, who are more open to social change that risks some of that, partly because they're being influenced by their children in ways that were not true, 20, 40, 60 years ago, even. So I don't have any expertise on that whatsoever. So I am just completely making stuff up with that. But anyway, I would say technology is a big responder to that. And I think economics, I don't know if you brought that up, Ethan, or if that was Brett, economics really does make a difference. So policy changes and protests that impact the economy, or that choose to attack the economy, like not taking the bus for over a year. By the way, almost 70% of bus riders were women. These were women who were organizing this, and that, there's nobody, you don't get organization like that unless you have who's writing the letters, who's communicating to everyone, who's making the phone calls, who's doing this. This is what women do. And they get very little credit in these kinds of movements for the last 200 years. And they're the ones that are actually kind of organizing it. Who's going to ride with who to work, who lives close enough to walk, what's going to happen here for a very long time, super inconvenient, but targeting the pockets. Same thing with the, when I think about South Africa and the end of apartheid, there were boycotts that were going on that helped, being publicly kind of shamed on the world sphere, not by the US, by the way. Ronald Reagan was like, attaboy, anti-communist South Africans, but that I digress. Also
an example of how single issue isn't really a great way to approach things.
Yeah, but the people in South Africa were going on strike. The workers that were being, really abused, the racial policies regarding labor. It was labor unions in South Africa that really broke the back of apartheid, because so many young black men and older black men too were being put into specific housing situations, and their labor was being controlled. And that kind of thing was where it really hit. So, companies and corporations, it's choosing, like they're kind of choosing now to try to get ahead of the curve. There's a lot of people who want long-term change, do not want us to just be reliant on the charity of corporations, but actually have real policy change, rather than just being like, oh, it's great that they think the culture has changed so much, so they need to change their policies in order to keep their customers and their fans. Lovely. Also, we need to not just rely on that. Just like here in Chattanooga, when we were the like Detroit of the Southeast, they called us the Dynamo of Dixie kind of thing. Lots and lots and lots of factories, and Walter Cronkite said we were the dirtiest city in America, so everyone assumes that we were. Walter Cronkite's not an environmental expert, so we were a very dirty city, but I do not know if we were actually the dirtiest city in America in the early 70s. But everyone, filthy. Everyone talks about you couldn't see, even though the top of Walnut Street Bridge, the women's pantyhose turned orange. Nobody could keep a clean shirt. Just very filthy. And when they decided to try to clean things up, they made some policies and that the factories couldn't pollute the way they were, cleaned it up, and then they decided to make it voluntary. And within 4 months, it was back to exactly how it had been before. So they realized, actually, that's going to actually take a law. We can't just rely on the generosity of these corporations saying, let's not, pollute the air and water in Chattanooga. So I don't know if that kind of gets at some of what I think does. I don't know that we can make any rules. It's not us. I was just on a panel last week where people were talking about how do we know what our legacy is, looking at some scripture passages. How do we determine our legacy? And I was like, we don't get to determine our legacy. Our other people, our children, great grandchildren, decide what our legacy was. We do what we do, and they'll tell us later, or we'll be dead and history books will tell us if what we did was actually making real change or not.
And they might be wrong. There's no one generation that is right in its judgment of the past. So, yeah.
200 years from now, they might say something different than 400 years, should the Lord tarry. They might say something different yet again. Yep.
One of the things that I did in preparation for this, and Brett looked at some movements as well. I picked the U.S. temperance movement to look at. I thought that was interesting for a few reasons. I'm really not sure how to connect that up, but I wanted to throw out a couple things that seem important to me about it somehow in the current discussion, and just let both of you riff on that. One was the connection of religion in that, and it wasn't purely secular or purely religious, but there was a strong blend, and the religious was certainly an important force for it. Another is that it was linked at some points to the women's suffrage movement, and that had some positive and negative effects on adoption. It's interesting in retrospect to look at what was the net effect of the choice of some activists to combine those two. It got its policy change, but then that policy change was considered a failure and was repealed. If we look at the policy change, the primary one is prohibition. And yet, 100 years later, U.S. alcohol consumption on a per person level is about a third of what it was at the time. So that's almost too much for me to take in all of that. But what do you guys think?
Well, honestly, I'm kind of tickled that you went that way, because as I was looking at Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and feminist movements in the first wave and second wave, one of the things that I kept coming across was the temperance movement. And then I thought, well, we see the current, I guess, one of the current criticisms of the Black Lives Matter movement, just to pick on that for a moment, is the integration of other concepts and equality and across multiple groups of people, not just this one group of Americans.
A lot more talking about intersectionality and economics,
right? And so that was kind of interesting to me, because my question was going to be, does that hurt us or does that help us as we look at existing the move towards progress in these very specific separate areas that we've kind of combined together in one loud voice? And so now I'm just going to defer the question to Dr. Diller because I don't have an answer.
It'd be fantastic. I mean, the temperance movement was totally a feminist movement, which is why, Ellen White would have been seen as a feminist. You don't talk about this. This was a women's movement issue, for sure. And of course, it was also anti-immigrant. And it has all kinds of, complexity. When you think about the 5 C's of historical thinking, complexity is one of those things. You don't get, it never is just one thing at all. And so that's a fantastic one, Ethan, to look at, say, but we still have blue laws all over the state. I'm in a state right now that's still, we're known for, our whiskey, but also there's a ton of places you can't sell whiskey or make whiskey or, even the policies stuck around, even if they weren't federal. And
couldn't ship alcohol until the coronavirus pandemic.
Yes. Oh, it's so funny how. Oh yeah,
a long tail there.
I don't want to digress on that. That's hilarious because I have a lot of friends who have a lot of thoughts on some of that are very grumpy about the fact that it is harder actually for them to drink than it used to be. For a variety of reasons, but some of them should be easier. So yeah, there's no, what is the long-term effect, like you're saying, and whether it's seen as a success or a failure. I mean, one can say the same thing about abortion. One could say the same thing about anti-communism as a social movement. The conservative social movements, we think of social movements as being liberal or progressive. There's tons of conservative social movements. Are they successful? Are they a failure? Like when we stamped out right-wing nationalists in the 90s, which the terrorist movements everyone was worried about in the 90s were domestic terrorists and then for 15 years when people said terrorists, all they thought was Muslims. We're backing off on that now, thank God, because we actually are much more at risk from domestic terrorists than we are from Muslim terrorists that are external or internal. But they changed tactics, and one could say, so have they become more successful, less successful as you think about who they elected, to the highest office in the land? Is that sort of the last gasp? Is it, we don't know yet. But thinking about whether they were sort of stamped out or whether they were seen as now passé, we can think about the Confederacy, and the lost cause idea. They lost the war, but did they lose really? Just those kinds of things, and how long down the road do you have to go before it's okay, it was now no longer successful, but it took that long before it was, and versus which parts of it, like you're saying, so for women, it was a benefit to women. I mean, women were able to speak out on temperance, and they got they cut their teeth on learning how to be public speakers, because no one thought women could speak in public, how to organize around something that they could legitimate by being women. And then you could say, I mean, we wouldn't have had voting, again, not just because they were able to say, if you both for and against, we don't want the women to vote because they'll vote out alcohol, or let's get the women to vote because they'll do it. Not just for that, but because they learned how to organize, they were able to organize to get the vote. So even though it wasn't, even if you take the actual subject of temperance, the infrastructure that they were able to put in place for that. A small aside that I kind of wanted to say when we think about long-term effects. So I regularly, I don't know, Brett, if you ever took World Societies from me when I assigned King Leopold's Ghost, which was about Congo and the Belgian activities in the Congo. And so my students one of the points of that book is that this was one of these very early social movement kinds of things that did a lot of the things that we think of in terms of organization. So a lot of the people who had been involved in abolition, now abolition is ended, the slavery is ended, they were the same people. And the author is very interestingly talks about the fact that a lot of people are these do-gooders, these justice warriors, they are always on about something, so now it's this, these are the same people that were on about abolition, that's taken care of. Now we've got, injustice in the Congo, kind of thing. So there was sort of a writing off of some of that, but also they said that the way to organize, learning how to mobilize through visualization, through data collection, through all this sort of thing, using the newspapers, all this sort of stuff that they learned was one of, again, the next. This was an intermediate kind of social movement that in many ways they thought was successful because they took Congo away from the king, himself, and it was no longer his private property. But in the long term, you could be but man, it was a disaster there still. I mean, it was still terrible what was going on. And then just, a month ago, they took down King Leopold's statue in Brussels, you know, like that was because one of the things he says at the end is like, every time we go and tour these big, you know, royal houses, and Belgium still was seen as kind of the victim. Ironically, in World War I, the Belgians would have their soldiers, have their employees of their companies cut off hands and feet of people in Congo who didn't want to do the rubber to terrorize them. And one of the things that gets told is that the Germans, when they invaded Congo in World War I, they cut off hands and feet of Belgians. That never happened. Like, that's not a thing that occurred, but it was part of the propaganda to get people to fight against Germany in World War I. But ironically, like making Belgians the victim, like poor little Belgium, she never. And so anyway, it's very interesting how long you have to wait before there is some sort of sense of actually, you know, kind of real reckoning with things that have either happened in the past. And that social movement did not go on past, you know, let's take it away from King Leopold. Okay, good. We've done that. Now let's move on to the next thing. And so we can look at that and go, maybe that didn't actually succeed, you know, in a way that real justice would call for. On the other hand, it's quite successful. So yeah, I think the temperance movement is a beautiful one for its complexity. Do you know what I've learned recently? Because I don't usually do American women's history. That's not my thing, but because I've been teaching it, I've been learning a lot. And my male Americanist colleagues know way more about women's history in the United States than I do. And so they recommended me some books and stuff. And they will probably teach the women's history classes in the future, and at least the American women's history classes. But I wanted to do it just for once, since it was 100 years since women got the right to vote. And I felt like I wanted to learn a little bit more. And that's what teachers do when they want to learn something, is they teach a class on it. So they gave me a book where the religious group that was most invested in women having the right to vote, temperance, almost all of the progressive things that we think of, and was most egalitarian for women, but most committed spiritually to temperance movement, were the spiritualists. This was an incredibly progressive movement. And I mean, I'm a good child of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Like, I have real ideas about what spiritualism was in the 19th century, and they're almost all wrong. Like, and also like the overlap between stuff Ellen White was doing and the stuff the spiritualist movement was doing is crazy. But anyway, I digress. And I'm not at all saying like Ellen White's the same as a medium, but for many people, for many women, like the spiritualist movement, which was always egalitarian and was very invested in health improvements, all the health reform movements, not just temperance, but the health reform in general, is a feminist movement almost entirely, in terms of its ideas about what's good for women, actually. And you can see this when you read Ellen White and the discussions of, you know, what good health should be like. And it's very clear that what this does is it really, all the way dresses work, the way, how cooking is happening, you know, the way homes are being organized, all of that is stuff that benefits women better. And so whether or not the health reform movement was successful or not, you know, that's a good question one could ask, depending on the kind of stream that you care about with health. And so anyway.
Yeah, I know that my beef bacon is going to let me into the kingdom, whereas pork bacon would not let me into the kingdom. So that's why I choose beef bacon, and I'm much healthier for it. When we were talking just briefly on Facebook about this, you had mentioned that you wanted to talk about, or that your experience was in movements that were much, much older. And so that got me kind of excited about what you were talking about. You know, was King Leopold one of those things, or what were you excited to bring to the conversation?
Well, I told Brett, Ethan, that I like to study failure. Like, I think the history of failure is interesting. And they're not always social movements. So I study Catholics in England as a persecuted minority and arguing for toleration. And so what I got interested in was the father-in-law of William of Orange, who came into England, James II, was Catholic. And I remember reading, just as an aside, of one sentence, you know, when you picking out your dissertation topics is sort of, it's not clear how that always happens. And I read a sentence in a book that was like, well, James invested his entire reign in attempting to re-Catholicize England through his missionary efforts. And because they failed, his reign was a failure. So I became super interested in, well, why did those missionary efforts fail? That's interesting. Like, you know, what, especially given all the conspiracies about how all the secret Jesuits that are everywhere, you know, that they had in the 17th century. Like, if there's like 20,000 secret Jesuit Catholics that are ready to march down from the north of England to take over, which is what they thought during the Popish plot, like, surely they should show up. They should be slightly more successful in their missionary movements. So that was in my own dissertation subject, trying to figure out why did those missionary efforts fail? Why wasn't he good at that? And missionary efforts often aren't very successful. So studying missions is very interesting because and are you successful as a missionary? And I remember hearing once that there's white lies, and missionary stories. And I like to talk to my students about that because I'm like, this is people writing back to their jobs. So tons of our historical records come from missionaries. Thank God for them. And tons of them are doing, and we're talking about 500 years ago with the Catholic missionaries that are coming to the New World, where they're talking about 19th century missionaries. We're talking about Seventh-day Adventists in the 20th century. When people are reporting back to the people who are paying their salaries or supporting them, well, they're going to talk about the things that are successful, right? They're going to say, whether you're talking about in the 400s in the Frankish kingdoms with people writing back to Christians, trying to convert the Franks, or the Vikings, missionaries to the Vikings in the 700s, trying to write back. And then archaeologists go in and go, I don't think these people were actually as Christian as the documents are saying they're Christian, which is why archaeology is really helpful to studying history. That doesn't mean they weren't successful, depending again on how we count success, although they probably themselves didn't see that they were. And what difference did it make, or what did they think counted as success? So this happens with Spain. These are not exactly social movements I'm talking about. I don't know if missionaries count as a social movement or not, but in Spain, because I studied the Spanish world too, a lot of people would say, well, the Spanish Empire wasn't very successful, which is, I don't understand that. Like a big bunch of the Western Hemisphere speak Spanish today. And one could argue that they had a good 400-year run that was, as decent as the Roman Empire. So I don't know what, they're always wanting the Spanish Empire to be in decline. I took an entire class called The Decline of the Spanish Empire. And basically the thesis statement is, when it was never declining. By what measures is it declining? Let's pick where our benchmark is and then how is it declining? But we know it ends, so we think it's always declining. Anyway, by what counts as success for them? If they're trying to do XYZ, you and I looking back and saying they should have been doing ABC doesn't mean they failed, potentially, if you're doing success by their own definition. So this is what historians are most interested in, is what did these people want to do? So we're less interested in going, well, I think they should have done that and they didn't, so they were failures. We can look at long-term consequences and say, would they have liked those long-term consequences? Is that what they wanted to happen? Maybe I like those long-term consequences, and so I think we kind of got lucky that that's how it turned out. They may not have liked those. So anyway, I don't know if that addresses some of what you were interested in.
A couple, I like talking about failures, and a couple things that come to mind as we talk about movements are, there are a couple examples I think we could pick of things that I think it's safe to say they failed by their own standards. You might look at the French Revolution and say, did anybody want that to come out the way it did? But I'm also thinking, somebody turned me on to reading the Soviet Union's Bill of Rights at one point a while ago, and it's really fascinating because it's really good. They had all sorts of rights, full equality for women. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion. I mean, it's a lot of people would read it and go, wow, it's better than ours. Didn't do any of it, by and large. It all fell by the wayside in various ways. None of it became real. But at some point, that was not just the rhetoric, but the policy, at least the one that made it on paper. And yet, we know what living in those countries was like. We know what actual freedom of speech and ability to discuss what was truly going on was like. We know what actual political power was like. And so surely failure by even the standards that they penned themselves at some point in their history. What are can we say anything historically about what endangers a movement to kind of that worst failure? Like disastrous failure. Like they had power and they created disasters with it.
Well, I think people in the Soviet Union I think would have thought we got rid of the czar, like depending on when you're asking them. And we're a world power and we're doing this. And some of it, they didn't necessarily care as much about the rights as they cared about the movement. So I think it does depend on, like, you and I can go, if these are your ideals and that's what you're trying to accomplish and that was your goal, maybe you didn't do that. But I think a lot of those people involved, success was the establishment of this new state. And so depending on who you ask kind of in it and what the movement looks like, for sure. And there's a lot more, again, like that we could say. I mean, right now we're looking at, I've been watching the Mrs. America. Finished watching that, about the attempt to put out the ERA, and so there's things that, like, again, you think is successful, like the temperance, we passed this prohibition, and then, oh, we decided that was bad and we threw it out. So was that success or was that failure? Like, so, I don't know for sure if you're meaning, like, when somebody, quote unquote, could be seen as being successful, like they got into power and then they did this, and then everything they said they wanted to do didn't happen. That, my friends, is the human experience.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. There's no finish line.
So,
and that's also why you were talking at one point about it coming back to just you and what do you believe that you should do, because not what is so-and-so going to think of it, or is it going to succeed even by your own standards,
right.
But success and failure,
and to not do anything, like, again, what counts as success or failure, and even in the Christian walk. So I'm speaking here now as a person of faith, potentially, and saying, I want to be somebody who reflects love in the world, and I fail every day. So my understanding of the fundamental framework that I view the world as a Christian through, well, one potentially of them, is that of confession. So, like, my fundamental posture as a Christian is confession on my knees. I have not been what I wanted to be in the world. I need a savior. I need forgiveness. I need unconditional love. I have to extend that to other people. And so the posture of confession that we have not done. So my friend, Tim Gillespie, who works in Southern California, and we've spoken together. And one time we were both asked to speak by our mutual friend, Alex Bryan, to kind of hit all of our geographies. To talk about the churches that we've planted. And basically he got up and talked about his church, Crosswalk, and all the amazing things they're doing. And I got up and talked about my church and said, here's what we wanted to do and we've not done it. Here's what we wanted to do and we've not done it. Here's what we wanted to do and we have not done it. Like, my fundamental posture is we have these goals, we have these things we're working towards, and yet we keep not doing them well. Like, we want racial justice in our congregation, and yet I have hurt two of my Black women friends on leadership with me by, bulldozing over them, or not having listened to them in the past, or, having to ask for reconciliation, like in my own congregation, like we're wanting. And this is where I think, as a white do-gooder in the world today, right now, I'm constantly reminding my other white friends, we are going to mess up all the time. We're not going to get it right. We want to be innocent and we don't want culpability. And so we'd rather not do anything. And I say this as somebody who talks a lot, and so therefore has to say sorry a lot. So I'm always just slightly grumpy about people who can just sit there and never open their mouth and say anything, and nobody ever knows, they don't ever heard anything, but they also aren't doing anything, like, or contributing, like, help us out here, folks. We got to get this done, So I have to always say sorry. I've honed quick apologies that are thorough and I hope mostly heartfelt, because I say things that I then have to, like, regret. But so part of me is like, we cannot do anything potentially so we don't mess up. And I think as white people who want to be on the right side of history potentially, or who want to do the right thing, and then yet we know I'm going to say this and it's going to be wrong and it's going to come across wrong, or I'm going to use the wrong words, or then guess what? The people I'm trying to help justice work. So our church is also concerned with people with disabilities, and how do we be inclusive for people with a wide range of both visible and invisible disabilities. Guess what? They don't all feel the same way about, what we should be doing or not doing and how we should be handling that. The same thing is true, like, for a ton of other things, fill in the blank, that there is not just one right way to do things, and therefore we aren't always going to get it right when we attempt to move forward. You can see this in the book of Acts with the attempts to feed the widows. It's just insert ad nauseum failure. And so in terms of like, this is what I wanted to do, my goals were, and then that's not happening. I mean, I think parents live with that constantly, right? You know, like, here's what I was hoping to do, hasn't quite looked like that. You know, we'll take the small wins we have and we're going to celebrate them and tell those stories and try to build on them and act like that might have been par for the course all the time, you know, because we aren't going to get it right. And so I'm all right with the fact that humans and our institutions and our organizations and our power structures fail and don't do what they want to do and don't live up to their best ideals. I think we need to keep talking back to them when they don't, and alerting them to that. And people died in the gulag trying to do that to the Soviet Union, you know. But it did come down probably sooner than they thought it would. And now there's a lot of people in specifically Russia, places that were not part of the empire, but in Russia, who are like, hey, that was a lot better than what we got going on now, you know. And so, you know, again, depending on where you ask people, was that successful or failure, they may have different notions of that.
I like that we got steered this way, because I think this question, Brett, for us arose because the four of us were kind of asking that, what should we do? And one of the things, you talking about history and prophets at the beginning put me in mind of this, because people have modes of operation and things they're good at and ways they view the world, and they're not all good at the same things. And can you imagine a historian being in the audience of an Old Testament prophet? You know, the prophet saying, remember the such and such ites. And the historian's like, technically, actually, it's more complicated than that. Prophet would be like, all right, get that guy out of here. I can't work with him in the audience. And to some extent, that's kind of what happens when we're all together on social media, and somebody who has the ability to unify and move people to action and to use emotion and rhetoric, just to use them, not necessarily dishonestly in the grand sense, but even to use them it makes some people feel dirty to have those things in the conversation. And I think historians and philosophers are some of those people. We want to go, no, my entire career is about making sure that we're totally clear on these things and not glossing over any of this detail. I can't do it. I can't even listen to it, you know?
Yeah.
And so I've had that.
In academia, we call it nuance. That's what we say. It's nuance.
Yeah. But then people, you know, then somebody from the oppressed group, with literal or figurative blood dripping from them, comes and says, what was that? What was the nuance you were caring about? I'm being stepped on here, you know? And that's kind of almost where I'm stuck at the moment. It's not, I know I can't become somebody that I'm not. And so I can't go shout slogans I disagree, of which I disagree with half of, but I do need to find something to do that's true to myself, and that actually helps. And that launched this question, I think, for us, Brett, because we were talking about the difficulty of adding our voices or actions to current events because of our inability to agree with some things that are passing, but and our kind of rightful marginalization in this because of our lack of breadth of experience and skin color and everything. And so we stepped back one remove and said, what else could we talk about? And one of the things was movements in general. Mm-hmm. And so it's almost why we're having this conversation, is a search for what can we do? And we meaning specifically some, you know, white intellectuals that aren't being pressed by things. We could ignore this completely. And we question whether perhaps we should. Mm-hmm. Because some of the voices are telling us, like, if you can't show up and carry water and believe these things, stay home.
Right.
Don't want you, don't need you. You're just gonna mess things up. And we're legitimately struggling with those questions right now.
Well, and if you listen to all the voices that are out there and want to please all of them, you won't please any of them. And so this is, again, what I'm like, as again, a quite lucky person, I would say, in life. Like one of my friends and I just were talking about, like, I mean, I'm neurotypical, you know, I've been able to be successful in my profession that I want. I've managed to, you know, live a good life without really exerting a ton of effort. I've had, my family is mostly still intact. Like nobody's died, you know, like, I mean, Tommy's brother did pass away. And that's a story for a different time, but it was also in many ways a mercy. And, you know, my family of origin, you know, there hasn't been any great tragedies. So, I mean, I'm really lucky. And all of that to say that, all of a sudden now I'm in a game where I'm going to mess up and I'm going to lose. I'm going to try to do some things or say some things that are going to be rejected, and that I'm going to be told to stay in my place. And in some ways it's sort of like, welcome to the game. There have been people that have been in this for centuries. They can never win. Like they're always going to be said, you're not supposed to represent your people, or you do represent your people, or, you know, you should be more like us. If you would assimilate, you would be able to do this. You're never going to be able to assimilate.
More Booker T. Washington. No, that's too much. More Martin Luther King.
Yes,
No,
that's right. That's right. So, you know, in some ways, like, I'm going to lose. I'm going to mess up. I'm going to have to say sorry. I'm going to lick my wounds, and I'm going to get back in. And maybe I'm finally here, you know, on what's real planet Earth for most people. And it's in many ways. And again, I follow, like, one of the things I would say, if you're nerdy, there's so much great reading and podcasts and things like that to listen to that I think that's not doing nothing. Like thinking and learning. Again, I'm being influenced by the fact that if you want to be an activist, policy change is what has to happen. But not everyone's an activist. And nobody's saying, I mean, there are people saying, but thoughtful people are not saying everyone needs to be an activist. And I think it's really hard when you've just learned something. So here's the other thing that happens when you're like a newly woke progressive and you've just learned something. And it's not just that. I teach 18 to 25-year-olds, and it's like, I tell people, it's like Groundhog's Day. We get to learn the same stuff over and over and over again. If you don't like that, if you don't want to follow the same loop where everyone's like, what? You know, like over and over again, then don't do it. But I enjoy it. And so, and everyone's like, I never knew this. Like nobody's been studying this. They never tell you this. And you're like, well, they kind of have been. But welcome, you know, you're here now. And they kind of have to learn things themselves over and over. And so I do think learning things actually, you know, and being there for ideas changing, create space. And you don't know how the Holy Spirit is going to use what you're learning and listening to and reading to tell you where your little spot is or isn't, and what voices are going to speak to you. But some of the people I follow who are really thoughtful, one of my people who I see as a mentor, Oshita Moore, who's in the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition. And she's a Black preacher who I just have been blessed so much by her work. And she recently on Instagram kind of had like, some people are reading, some people are having conversations with their friends, some people are at the marches, some people are carrying the water, some people are working quietly and long for, you know, everyone's doing their own work. I do think we're in a moment when the pot is boiling, and we're going to decide, is it just going to evaporate into steam, or are we making something with this? And I want to be part of something constructive happening, and with all of the new information and things that are out there. And here's another thing that I will say to kind of, when you've learned something, so this is kind of going back to what I said before, when you've learned something, when I've learned something, you're now immediately, you're a convert, and there's nobody that's more outraged than a convert, right? Like, I cannot believe that people are doing this. And I'm like, baby, you learned that last week. Like, and now you're like, what? You know, that anyone's doing this or saying this. And it's a normal human reaction. I'm used to this. I get to see this and so there's a lot of what you're seeing, you know, is people who are learning things kind of for the first time. And they're, you know, that the old analogy of the CrossFit evangelist, you know, they're now like, you must do this, you know, and sure. You know, that's okay. They're like that, but that's not the end of the story. And I'm more interested in people that have been here for a while and sort of have seen things go. And those people tell me reading stuff, thinking, engaging, quietly finding where I can financially support maybe a ministry, an organization, quietly sending encouragement, quietly showing up, quietly having the conversations, whatever it is that is in my backyard is what we need to be doing. And then we have stamina for it. It's sustainable, and it's more fits with our gifts and our goals. But what I will say is we are afraid to do the wrong thing. And that desire for innocence does not stand us in good stead. Being able to say sorry, as we know, if you have healthy relationships, is very important. Quickly, it's part of why we have to force our kids to do it, because we don't want to do it, and they have to learn. We have to learn to try to at least say sorry, and then try to do better. And we're learners, so when we tell our young people, we want them to not feel bad about when I hand an essay back to someone that's all marked up. I don't want them to be like, fine, I'm never going to write again. I want, we're learners. I still get it all marked back. I don't get to turn anything in without it being marked up. This is me putting a draft in. It's going to get a little marked up. I'm going to try differently next time. It's never going to be perfect with no needing to be marked up, but it might be good enough, and it might contribute a little bit down the road.
It might have been worth doing.
Yes, it might have been. So that, by the way, Ethan, is one of I have a few fundamental life commandments. One of them is show up to stuff. And the other one is, and say stuff out loud, which won't surprise anybody. But the other one is, if it's worth doing poorly. And so and my friends are like, can you just say imperfectly? If you want something done super well, with excellence and just amazing, knock it out of the park, don't ask me to do it. But if you just need something done, I might be your girl. I can maybe get some stuff done. So I'm not the greatest employee because I'm just going to do what I need to do, but in any case, I would say to fellow, middle class, midlife white people who care about, being good people in the world, and aren't completely closed-minded to anything changing, that in some ways the bar is really low for us. I don't know what overlaps there will be in audiences here, but yesterday I participated with the Kansas Avenue Church in Riverside. They did an afternoon podcast with just white people. And so they primarily represent a range of Black churches, Black Adventist churches in Southern California. And there were 300 people watching live that were on either Facebook or the Zoom. And I think more people watch after that were really interested. But primarily, they told us a Black audience. So there were 6 of us. The positive reactions we got, it's low-hanging fruit. It's low-hanging fruit. You would have thought we were people I've never participated in conversations like this before. I've never heard white and Black people talking like this. I've never gotten to talk to white people about this. Low-hanging fruit. The bar's low. Low.
That suggests something really interesting to me, and maybe this is a tangent. We've been thinking about what to do, and we've been thinking about podcasts and YouTube and conversations. And what you said just got me wondering about a little system in which, anybody can share something for 5 minutes about their experience in the world or in relation to a movement or something. And every time yours is listened, everybody submits one. And every time yours is listened to, you have to listen to somebody else's.
It's like StoryCorps with homework. I like it.
And so it's if you want to get out there and say, gosh, I just feel like nobody cares what I as a white male thinks, and I don't like this thing, and I should be able to use this flag and blah, blah, blah. You can say that for your 5 minutes and why. But if anybody's ever going to listen to it, you have to listen. If you want a dozen people to listen to that of yours, you have to listen to a dozen other voices.
And they're randomly assigned. You don't get to go randomly and pick and choose.
Or even aggressively assigned.
Yeah.
And people might show up and go, you know what, I'm going to hate some of the stuff I hear, but they're going to hear me.
I like it.
Anyway, that just came to mind.
I want to just ask one quick question, and this may be really hard to answer quickly, but I want to just make it the last thing I ask you because it comes off of last week's conversation that we had. Dr. Diller, how do you feel about monuments? and and I'm not, maybe not even just necessarily the monuments that are in question right now, but
Historians never erect monuments. We also don't play historical dress up. Okay. So we're terrible about stuff like this. I was actually asked to be on the Mayor's Council on Women here in Chattanooga to erect a monument for the suffragettes. And there were two of us, one from UTC and me, on this committee. We ended up splitting off from the rest of the committee because as historians, it's too painful to be part of that process. We did our way to honor the suffragettes is to do an oral history project where we interviewed 200 women in Chattanooga with our students and put there's a just inordinate amount of not representative amount of Adventists in that oral history project, but now it's available globally for everyone to use in terms of a research collection of women in Chattanooga. So so again, historians are like, we're not into erecting monuments. That's just not a thing that we do. So we're not emotionally attached to them. Historians, we don't care. Like, this is not about history. This is about people that people at a certain time wanted to honor in some way. And so if our opinion is, people decide, we took down the statue of King George III, after the revolution in Boston. These are symbolic things where we say, this is who we hold up as an ideal. And I'm personally fine if a society says we no longer idealize those. What I do hear from a lot of historians that I think is accurate is that there's so many different people that we should be thinking about and memorializing that we aren't. Like, we erect monuments to the same people over and over. And there's places that we could be putting plaques up, or places that these amazing people lived or did interesting things that we should be commemorating, probably historians aren't going to be spending as much time invested in taking down monuments as in trying to say, here's some other people that we should be thinking about. Although I'm totally fine I'm very tempted to go down and deface the Confederate monument that's on our courthouse lawn in Chattanooga. So, that's my gut instinct is like, this should not be here. But I will not be doing that.
Well, I'm glad we didn't just indict you publicly for future job opportunities.
Oh, it's good cover now if you want to go do it.
Yeah, that's right. I just am thinking now QR codes as the new monuments that you can scan on your phone, but that will be kept relevant, historically accurate, and we can just change the copy behind the QR code moving forward. All right. We have benefited greatly from your experience, your wisdom, and your enthusiasm. Thank you so much for chatting with us today about this. Ethan, was there anything you wanted to say in summary?
No, I think
Okay.
This was a lovely talk. I'm gonna have to chew on it in the coming hours and days. To know, I don't know, but it was just great in and of itself. This was relaxed, and yet we covered lots of interesting territory.
Well, Dr. Diller, is there anything you wanted to close out with?
I just love knowing that people who have humanities educations are out there abroad in the world, doing important and useful things. And you are both great, examples for parents who are like, I don't want my kid to major in XYZ. There's employability in the world, and also you're good citizens and thoughtful citizens. And this is what we thought we were going to be doing in college anyway, right? Or in higher ed, like having good discussions and not solving anything once and for all, but like being better and smarter because of it.